Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. And we start with a question. What does it mean, really, to commit yourself to non-sectarian socialism? What does it mean to live in an age of anti-popular politics? Popular politics, ironically, is often placed against democracy. But the answer to this elitist impulse is generally itself a Bonapartist counter-elitist impulse. The complexity of our current society, the complexity of international capital, and even decoupling it, and the kinds of strange attractors that emerge, the cascading factors that emerge from logics that no one can see, clustering off fractally in the distance, outside of the initial logic which set up the whole thing. Why non-sectarian? Why not anti-sectarian? Why not left unity? Well, this came out of two things. One, the realization that the discourse about the discourse on social media was actually driving me to have to be concerned about things that I think are fundamental distractions. It becomes a meta discourse, discourse about discourse about discourse. And I realized that the one most common accusation, other than being liberal, is being a larper. I started making this accusation at people around 10 years ago. Why did I make the accusation? Because everyone seemed to be playing at politics as something that you believed or just advocated on your own, or that you could just force upon people from your tiny little sect upon an agreement of a political program that was invariant or comprehensive. You and I both know, in reality, no matter how much you think that is true, you do not know all the conditions, you do not know all the logics, you do not understand all the repercussions, and neither do I. It is hubris to think that you do. We are all LARPers now, because most of us have no effect on politics. Ironically, the laws of large numbers ensure this. Aggregate trends dominate the situation and place a lot of power in individuals who can act where the aggregate largely can't. But they do so outside of the realm of traditional politics because the complications and compromises are harder and harder to reach. Why are they harder? Because people do not have the local levers anymore. They don't have local media. They're often engaged in international or national media and small chunks. It would be easier to turn this into a Jeremiah than what I'm about to say. It'd be easy to rail against the state of the discourse, to talk about people not seeing the forest for the trees or not seeing the trees for the leaves. But there's a discussion that needs to be had. Rigidity and dogma tends to be a sign of the collapse of a lived tradition. Rigidity in the subject tends to be a sign that you can't make and generate the subject as a vibrant community or a vibrant political force that is both in and for itself, both sociologically real and active. The way a lot of abstracts have been used, from identity even to parts of class, are to avoid that question. Who runs things? How do they run? Where does the money actually lead? Do we help some counter elite? I've learned to distrust people who claim to be leftist for this reason. Whether or not they're tailing Republicans or tailing Democrats, they're tailing people with certain interests that they aren't saying. They might not even know. If you assume that all this is irrelevant to power anyway, and everyone can just go, oh, the left has no power. Most people's dynamic politics have no power. Mass politics is not mass. It exists on the ground in hashtag movements and rebellions and points and flashpoints, but it doesn't congeal. And in that sense, it doesn't have effect. It might change some things locally, but since it's not coordinated and not directionally comprehensive, it can't change things altogether. And while we need to understand who our enemies are, they aren't just elites, because that's a vague notion. But understanding the generational cycles of capitalists, understanding investments, understanding the larger cycles of profitability cannot be answered simply by textual orientation or fitting what evidence we have to textual orientation. To say we need something new is both obvious and not particularly helpful. I'm a non-sectarian because, frankly, I don't trust any of the people in any of the sects to have a comprehensive enough vision, but I do trust them to see individual things that I don't see. Hence why I works with so many different types of groups, from real progressives, an MMT and socialist-oriented group, many non-socialists in that group too, to TIR, This is Revolution, whose politics range from social democratic to national liberationist. From Sublation Magazine, who's often engaged in social critique, some of which I virulently disagree with. To Strange Matters Magazine, which I often find in its, quote, libertarian socialism, unquote, to have notions that concede too much to the popular morality of people in specific places, specific biases, etc. But all of them do valuable work when synthesized together. This is why my prior view on not working with certain sects only applies to groups that I have seen be actively damaging or actively confused. We should not conflate norms and descriptions. We cannot derive an ought from an is, at least not without a step justifying the relationship of what should be to what already is. It requires a justification and an action and a way to maintain it. In the current situation, specialists who try to alter the world beyond their narrow speciality have to speak ex cathedra on things they probably can't know. And generalists are rarer and rarer because there's fewer rewards for it. And so much that there are rewards anywhere, it seems to be in places like the military or in very specific parts of business. But even there, true general competence in multiple subjects is not generally encouraged because it requires both a lot of leisure time or a lot of dedication beyond which one normally has to dedicate to one's immediate objective. A lot of the ruthless criticism, which is absolutely necessary on the left, also leads to antisocial behavior, to doing things that do not build the subject or community needed to enact the politics one wants. So one's larping is perpetual and self-reinforced. But it's not just the left. I'm not even sure I know what the left means. See, I sat down to write an article trying to figure out what all the different variants of the left is right now. Different identity politics, different intersectionalities, different Marxist-Leninisms, all of which substitute things from other idea sets and don't often admit it. And they're all subject to the larger cultural trends. How many of you fell for Bernie because it was a cultural moment to fall for Bernie? And by fall for Bernie, I'm not even condemning him. This is not about individual actors. That's my difference from a lot of people who valorize incoherence as long as it seems like it promotes an enemy. They are voluntaristic. They believe in magical forms of will. Nor do I think the systemic contradictions of our various bourgeois rights are easily overcomable just by adherence to any sort of legal principle or document. But that we must organize around the principle, otherwise research and political programs are impossible. One who only deals with the totality cannot see the mechanisms within the totality. If one's only looking at a clock, one cannot see its gears. Conversely, if one only sees gears, one does not get the movement of the clock. This we have to do. But how do you get out of that in an era of anti-populist politics? One is actually talking to different kinds of people and getting a richer notion of what they are and why they think that way. Not just so you can defeat their opposed politics, but you can actually understand what they need and why they need it and how you might meet it. And how to do that without being sucked into the other notions of time and place that exist. You can say it's time to burn it all down, but you don't have a match. And they have water. And you're going to need shelter afterwards anyway. That alienation is real. And it encourages frustration, lack of empathy, defensiveness, etc. Now, I'm a pretty aggressive person, so much so that I'm taking a break from Twitter. But we have to ask ourselves some real questions. What is the current elite? How is it related to the old capitalists? Why are capitalists and bourgeois seemingly not fulfilling any mission? Why is the left unable to do this either? Why is the right unable to really do it? Why, when faced with real social problems, does it retreat to boogeymen and witch hunts? And people who want to argue with me that this is a manifestation of fighting elite, I would like to tell you it's a smaller elite fighting a bigger elite. Let's not be silly. You can pretend that Ron DeSantis didn't go to an Ivy League school just because you think most of them are tea-toting liberals if you want to. But you're frankly just as full of shit as the people who pretend that everyone who runs the world is some homophobic evangelical Christian because they're not really in charge. Do we have to listen to these people, all of these people, because they see things we don't? They see things I don't, and I see things you don't. And convincing people and moving around with people requires solidarity and requires criticism, but it requires it in a way that allows people to adjust and save face and not be shamed unless one is out to destroy. To use a kind of pretentious metaphor to classical satire, we need Horatian satire, the gentle satire of fixing and of aiding, and not Juvenalian satire, the brutal satire of character assassination. We incentivize the wrong things when everything is always at a fever pitch, and every principle, no matter how much it's forgotten within a few months or a year, becomes paramount during the time. I can't tell you how many left-wing fads have happened in the past decade. The past 2 decades. what you can and cannot critique, what is and is not okay. Whether we're arguing about political correctness, call out culture, or wokeness, floating symbols that had meanings before they were ever introduced to the popular discourse. And yes, there are relevances in all these things. The Wittgensteinian view, the view that these are resemblances, are more useful maybe than any strict delimitation. From one spectrum of bird to another, there's a couple of criterion that are consistent, but then you run into a monotreme and you don't know what to do. Even between such clear biological categories, often there's more haziness than anyone wants to admit or deal with. That is doubly true in social categories. Debate won't settle this, because debate is performative. It's about convincing a few people that we know, but we actually don't have the answers to a lot of the fundamental questions about this anti-popular moment. Things could be different, but it's not just about believing that they should be or convincing others that they should be. You have to convince others to change the way they organize themselves fundamentally. But to do that, you also have to make it worth it, and you have to listen to them. And you have to work with different kinds of people and make compromises, both moral and political. You also have to know where your lines really are and be very clear on it. And the last thing you want to do is be fooled by discourse. We don't want to undermine the political subject we are trying to create by inculcating values that undercut it. Humans are free, but they are not free of their own choosing. We make our history, but it is not made of our own choosing. To play on Marx, it is not just about what we believe, it's about what we can actually make. And until you can do that, and until you understand what you want and the full variety of your enemy, then perhaps you really don't understand much at all. Whether or not we call something X, fascist, authoritarian, or whatever, is somewhat irrelevant. And partisanship here, without a party of our own making, without a party that represents our subject and our subject's interests primarily, is a delusion. It's toxic. It makes you blind to certain things and overly aware of others. But you can't just build the party out of will. You can't just will it to be. It won't succeed, both legally and materially. I don't know the answers to all these questions, and I'm not here to chastise you about that right now. It's easy for me to do. I'm here to say that you should listen, and I should listen, and that's why I do these interviews, and that's why I read your comments, even though often I find some of the debates mind-numbingly vulgar in their simplifications, and to have completely unrealistic views of how the world works, of how simple victory is just probably never even possible, and how many of you seem like you live in a world of very simple moral narratives that you have confused with politics to the detriment of both morality and politics. That you've conflated descriptions and norms to the point neither are really helpful for you. But the question to me isn't to chastise people about that alone, is to ask, why has that become so common? What incentivizes that? And it's going to be larger than TikTok or Facebook or your political media that you invest way too much into. And with that, the answer to the limits of debate and the way to encourage the virtues of the subject is to know the subject, to have the conversation, to treat this as an open question towards which we build for an orientation, and a program, if it emerges from that orientation in dialogue with the people who believe in it and the subject which would be able to enact it. That's all. I'm going to be tethering down the channel for a while. Not getting rid of anything. You may have noticed a series of shows, Excavations, which is where I invite friends of the show to come on and read text with me. Radical Engagements, where I deal with text, chapters of books, essays, etc. Nailing It Down, which are explainers, and Nailing It Down is going to have to slow down. I really can't do more than 1 or 2 a month. It's too much reading. If you'll notice on my shows, often there's 10, 15, 16 sources for one of those shows. And I'm covering somewhat obscure topics, and sometimes I'm reaching the limit where I'm going to have to deal. And like, I have a undergrad's understanding of German with a living and, with having been to Munich and stayed there for a significant amount of time, but not enough to be fluent. And I got to deal with some German text, things like this. So I'm working on a video on Ron or Soundbite. It's going to be a while. I'm also backing down from social media. I find that I get irritable in the discourse, and I start attacking people through subtweet or vague post or whatever. And sometimes it actually does damage to camaraderie and comradeship and friendship. Moral conviction has to be tempered. Our moral righteousness has to be tempered with actual convictions and commitments to community and friends and colleagues. Otherwise, there is no virtue there. Because how can you build what is good with no one to build it with you? A social system is never one person and one person's righteous indignation. We have to speak to each other and speak honestly. And to do that, there has to be some safety and an understanding of where the lines are. And if there are no meaningful lines, if the meaningful line is whatever the gust of popular sentiment is in the discourse around the left, without that even being concretely defined, and it can't be completely pinned down, it will always be to some degree relative and floating. That's why it's a metaphor, a directional metaphor. It's always moving around. But we have to figure that out. Good night and good luck. I'd like to thank my new patrons. There's been a lot of changeover recently. I think that's just because some people are going through some economic hardship and some other people are signing on. And I do appreciate those people I would like to thank the new Conical Hanran, Nihara J. I hope you all have a great day.